220 translation services. Like the rivers that come together here, many languages and cultures have come together to create one of the cultural capitals of the world, which is this place, Montreal. And as such, as part of the Quebec nation. I like to believe there is strength and enormous potential in the diversity we find in Montreal. Now, as you may have noticed, I'm a bit of a language nerd. I'm fascinated by the linguistic mixing of languages that takes place here, and it sometimes makes Anglophone Montrealers temporarily incomprehensible to visitors from elsewhere. Come to my vernissage. We're having a 5 à 7. Yeah, it's on Guy Street. Or maybe giving directions. Just take the autoroute. I'll wait for you here on the terrace. Someone from elsewhere won't get much of that. You won't understand all of it, because English in Montreal is not like English elsewhere. Montreal English, in fact, is full of Gallicisms. A Gallicism is a word that is used in English that is originally from French. One Gallicism in particular has particularly interested me, especially for tonight, the word Anglophone. Anglophone is not an English word. It's a word that came into the English language, strangely enough, through the Quebec Quiet Revolution. There's a tool on Google called an N-gram viewer, and if you check Anglophone and Francophone in the English corpus, they only start arriving in literature as of 1960. So the whole concept of Anglophone in many ways comes at the same time, it's birthed at the same time as the Quebec national identity took its strongest forms of the 70s and 80s. I find it curious that this emergence of the Anglo identity is so intimately tied to the consolidation of a French Quebecois identity. Use of English in Montreal obviously predates the use of the word Anglophone. We can't really talk about people before 1960 as Anglophones, but they spoke English. So who is the Anglophone community? Where do these people come from? Well, it certainly wasn't just a tiny enclave of owners and managers on the slopes of Mont Royal, exploiting workers and capital, though that's a nice story. It was loyalist heritage communities throughout Quebec. It was my ancestors in the Gaspé, fishing the waters of the Baie de Chaleur. Or actually, no. That's wrong, I'm sorry. The other side of the Gaspé, actually in the St. Lawrence estuary, Douglastown. It was working class neighborhoods here in Montreal, like Point St. Charles, Verdun, even St. Henry, Griffintown. It was immigrant communities and refugee communities who came here over the years. It was even some native peoples who adopted English as their primary language. Not necessarily something they wanted to do, but they do speak English to this day in many native communities in Quebec. The descendants of all these people identify today as Anglophones, or could be identified as Anglophones. As I said, the word Anglophone is not necessarily a word that the community itself came up with. It was someone else who identified Anglophones as a community. Were written into laws as a community. I'm not sure there's any Anglos who actually started saying having a pride as Anglos until much later. Mostly middle class and working class folk, this I assure you. So in preparation for tonight, I spoke with a lot of Anglo activists to get a sense of the depth of the Anglo-progressive left heritage here. And if we can consider the Patriot Rebellion as part of the heritage, we can look to the important roles played by Irish and English in that Republican struggle. Nelson's, Callahan's, more. It was a Republican struggle, primarily. Come the 20th century, we had waves of East European Jewish immigration that brought socialist and Marxist ideals to the Plateau and Mile End. Bagels too, actually. Thank God for that. That neighborhood is full of labor halls. Places like the Sala Rosa, where we see music from an international perspective. Part of our heritage, this particular heritage disappeared without a whimper from the press just 6 weeks ago. The former headquarters of the United Jewish People's Order was torn down after years of neglect. It was a kosher butcher for many years, that building. It was a corner of Esplanade and Laurier. And there was a write-up about it as it being one of the hotbeds of early Marxist agitation here in Montreal with the Polish community.
What was it called?
The hall was, it was originally the United Jewish People's Order, and then the Labor Jewish Congress, I think, took over, who eventually became the Labor Party in Israel. Don't quote me on all that. My research only went so deep. But it's still, that neighborhood was where Fred Rose was, of course, elected, the very first communist member of parliament in Canada, or North America, really, I guess. He was a central figure from that neighborhood in the communist movement at the time. It was Cartier riding between 43 and 47. The post-war period, of course, saw many struggles waged hand in hand by Francophone and Anglophone activists. I can think of no better image than Leah Roback and Madeleine Parent hand in hand in front of the Dominion Textiles building, not 5 blocks from here. They were also central actors in the anti-war organizing campaigns of many of the generations, working in groups like Voices for Peace, which met at the Simone de Beauvoir Institute, which is now part of Concordia. Concordia has long been a site where English students have organized successfully for generations now. From the computer riots of '69 to the conflict over Netanyahu's speech in 2002. In recent years, the work of such groups as the Frigo Vert, QPERG, the Gender Advocacy Center, have all been central to the advancement of many social movements in Quebec. Should mention also the English church organizations in Montreal have also had an enormous impact, an enormous footprint, I should say, in social activism. The Social Justice Committee at the Catholic Community Services, St. Columba House, St. James United Church, Tyndale St. George, Unitarian Church, and more. Dans la Rue itself was a creation of Father Emmett Pops Johns. There are many other organizations that are made up of and serve the English-speaking community that I don't have the time to get into. I'll just mention a few important ones. The Immigrants Worker Center, the Black Community Center, Head and Hands, Project Genesis, the South Asian Women's Organization, and the English School Board and CEGEP unions. So to sum up, English-speaking Quebecers have nothing to be ashamed of. On the contrary, we have been equal partners in the struggle for a move for we have been equal partners in the struggle for a movement towards a just society. Saying that Anglos are an important minority that make up an integral part of the Quebec nation and shares its political destiny should not be controversial. In fact, it's part of Québec Solidaire's program. We're here tonight to put some teeth into that proposition by finding our role in defeating the Liberal government in the next election. The Anglo community is the hard nut at the center of the Liberal fruit. Cracking that nut will surely sour the fruit. So we need to talk. So I'm going to pass the microphone over. Nora is going to start us off. Nora Laredo, thanks for coming. And here.
Wow. Okay, first of all, I'm so excited to be talking about Quebec Solidaire in English. In Quebec City, there's not many Anglophones, right? Like there's 2% of us or something. No, maybe a little bit more, but and actually I'm going to time myself because otherwise I'm just going to talk all night and I'll miss my bus home. For folks who don't know me, I thought it was a good idea to start because I think that the discussion around Anglophones means different things to different people depending on what kind of Anglophone you are, right? So I'm from Ontario. I grew up in Southern Ontario, so you can totally tell how much wicked culture I have. My family has been in Canada for many generations. The Italian family did pass, part of them passed through Montreal, part of them passed through New York, and then ended up in the beautiful land of Northern Ontario, Timmins, which is where my roots are. And so I'm an Anglophone by only 5 years in this province, but my partner is a professor at the university in Quebec City, and he was hired with speaking no French, not a word of French. And they were like, you will learn, and you will teach chemistry to 200 students every year. And he was like, yeah, no problem. It's going to be like English, right? And he fast learned that it's not at all like English. But we're in it for the long haul. We're there for well, until he dies, because he's tenured, so it's really great. So I come at this as a bit of an outsider. I don't have deep roots in the province. I don't have deep histories, although I did watch the referendum, and my God, I really wanted it to fail that night. I have changed my position. I'm a sovereigntist, but I was 9, so whatever, or 12. So the way that I'm going to frame this discussion is to talk a little bit about sovereignty in a different way, and I think it reflects the way that I hear my young comrades talking about sovereignty too in French, right? So keep in mind, I don't have an Anglophone milieu where I debate this kind of stuff. The Anglophones who I know are progressive, don't care about sovereignty, and actually are supportive of Quebec solidaire, or they're American and they're working Quebec City for Ubisoft. Or they're there for love and they're like kind of flaky. So it's a completely different environment than Montreal. But I think one of the questions we have when we talk about what we want in Canada, in English Canada, and English Canada I mean including Quebec English Canada, often goes back to the question of colonization, post-colonial state structure, and Canada, what needs to happen in Canada to fix a lot of the problems that we have. And the core of that is opening and undoing the Canadian Federation, period. That is because Canada has been built on top of many nations who still, to this day, fight for their liberation and fight for their right to their language and to land and to be out of poverty and to be able to govern themselves in a traditional way. And that's really important because in the Canadian Constitution, the Canadian Federation, it is not possible to implement the demands of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, for example, without fundamentally changing sovereignty in this country. And so I come from that position because it helps to remind ourselves that this discussion about sovereignty, when we talk about it in English, actually means sovereignty not just for Quebec, but it means sovereignty for Indigenous nations, real sovereignty for Indigenous nations. And it also means a new arrangement for people outside of the major power centers. I don't know how much of you folks spend time on Bay Street in Toronto, but Bay Street is a colonial force, and Bay Street steals money out of every mining community in this country. And so if you are in northern Manitoba, or you are in northern Ontario, or you are in northern Quebec, your experience with the state is very, very similar, right? There's very little local control that you have. So when I talk to Anglophones about sovereignty, I have to start there because it's very rarely going to find a progressive person saying, oh, I don't support self-determination. Self-determination for Indigenous people is kind of like a foundational value that we have to start with as progressives. And so if that's true, then what does that actually mean for Canada? And so that opens up a democratic discussion that we absolutely need to have and that the people in this country have never had on creating a people's constitution. Which of course brings us to, who's the only party calling for people's constitution? Oh yeah, it's Quebec solidaire, that's great. What a coincidence, right? Questions about sovereignty open up spaces that I think are invisible to Quebecers and that are really, really obvious if you're not from Quebec. And so what do I mean by that? I mean, when we talk about childcare in Quebec and the role that educating children from a young age has in this society, because we want to make sure Quebec children are taken care of. We want to make sure that Quebec women and men, but primarily women, are in the workforce. We are building a projet de société. We are building something for ourselves to liberate ourselves, to protect our language. Having sovereignty in that discussion gives us the frame to come up with social projects like that, to come up with free college, to come up with a subsidized higher education system. When you talk to someone in Saskatchewan about fixing the social problems in Saskatoon, it is so desperate. We are ignored by Regina or by politicians in Regina, and we have no control over what's going on in Ottawa. And we have no conception of ourselves and no liberatory project. And so we're just going to do whatever we can, good work in our communities. And I think that we forget that in Quebec, that the distinct society discussion has given us so much for us to be able to talk about sovereignty in a different way, that when we talk about it in English and when it's controlled by CJAD or controlled by the Gazette or whatever Anglophone decision influencers or whatever, then it gets totally distorted to be about how capital is going to flee and how it's a racist discussion. The racist discussion is a really important one for us to have. There's absolutely no question about that. But we have to reframe sovereignty in a way that actually reflects what are the fundamental problems of Quebec society and how are they related to Canada. And then we also have to talk about sovereignty, not just from Canada, because anybody that thinks that Canada, that Ottawa controls anything, isn't paying much attention to what Ottawa is doing, right? Ottawa is not sovereign from the United States, right? Ottawa is not sovereign from global forces of capitalism. And so when we talk about sovereignty, we also have to talk about what it means to actually have democracy, what it means to have people power, and what it means for individuals to have control over the decisions that are being made in their communities. Is that through a constituency assembly? Is that through a new constitution? Is that through a new federal arrangement with all of the provinces? Is that through creating new provinces because the provinces themselves are kind of wacky and they don't really reflect the realities within their spaces? Maybe. But if you believe in democracy in general, then you believe in the ability of average people to have an opinion and to participate politically. And so how can anyone be opposed to that? You cannot be opposed to that discussion. So what our task as progressives is to actually influence that discussion so that we're having the right debate, that we're having perhaps not the right, the correct debate. We're having a debate on the left about what we think sovereignty looks like. What does it mean if we stop corporate welfare programs? What does it mean if we nationalize a rapid rail service between Montreal and Quebec? What does it mean if we actually have people powered driving political choices and putting an end to our love affair with the politics of the Liberal Party that we are progressive here and we're going to give $1 billion to Bombardier? All right. I only have a minute left or 2 minutes left, so I'm gonna just quickly say, on the question of the NDP Quebec, I think a lot of this kind of filters into this as well. I'm just gonna throw that out there that it'd be fun to have a conversation about that after, but it's not really what I'm gonna talk about here. But I challenge you to think about it in that way, that if we believe that people have the ability to determine for themselves what is best for them, then that necessarily means linguistic minorities, racial minorities. That necessarily means that we have people who are among our ranks who are representative of communities or who are embedded in their communities. And it's only that way, it's only when we have a critical mass, in this case, we're just right here talking about Anglophones, when we understand the way to talk to other Anglophones about these issues, to start poking holes in the right-wing rhetoric that gets fed to us all the time by the English media that absolutely needs to stop. And the forces against us are very difficult because I know when we talk about sovereignty, we as Quebec solidaire, and by we I actually mean Amir, not me, or you, when we talk about this stuff in the media, it's always responding to the right-wing frame of sovereignty. We so rarely have the opportunity to reframe it. And so as activists, we have to have these discussions in forums like this to reframe it. And it has never been more important than today, because we know that the rise of the ethnic nationalist right in this province is the most pressing. I'm in Quebec City, so it is one of the most pressing crises that we face. And depressing, right? On just 2 blocks from my house, I was in a rally protesting La Meurthe, La Meurthe and Soldiers of Odin. And Atalante showed up with a Nazi-era banner talking about taking over control of our businesses. They are distributing flyers against Starbucks as a multinational corporation and to support local businesses. Okay, the ethnic nationalist right is gaining power in this province, and if we on the left don't figure out how to talk to Anglophones, how to talk to allophones, how to talk to immigrants and refugees, how to talk to racialized Quebecers who've been here forever but who are erased by all of the forces that erase them, then we might as well go home, because the stakes have never been so high. But I think we have the solution. I think we have the tools at our disposal. And I'm so excited that this conversation is starting tonight, because I think that from here, we will come up with the best arguments, the best strategies, and the ways to shut down the haters however we can.
Thank you, Norm. That was great. We're going to pass it on to Tyrone Benskin now.
Hello, and great to see so many faces here and a few familiar faces as well. Thank you very much for your very impassioned. I'm not going to be nearly as impassioned as you are. How do we defeat the Liberals? I don't know. What I can say is, rather than focusing on how do we defeat somebody, how do we identify who we are? How do we separate ourselves from what is there? I had the blessing of being elected in 2011 to the first NDP official opposition in Ottawa. And one of the things I think that I carry away from that is the fact that how we did it was staying true to the 50-year values that the NDP had fought for and worked for up until that point. We found a voice in Jack Layton who was able to articulate those values, articulate those positions, not change them, articulate them. And there's a difference, I think. There's a very important difference. It's not about becoming more centrist. It wasn't about becoming more appealing. It was about being able to find the words. He found the words that were able to entice people like myself to the party. It was about working together, which was the motto in 2011. And I think our faith in systems and organizations and so forth is being tested right now, and it's being tested with just cause. We're putting too much faith in systems. We're looking at this system, we're looking at that system, saying, let us go to this system, let us go to this group, let us go to this organization and follow that. We need to find our own voices. We need to find like voices. As Anglophones, I've been here since, actually next year will be 50 years that I've been here. Yeah, I'm aging myself. And I've lived no place else other than Montreal. I've lived other places in terms of work as an actor. I've lived in Los Angeles. I lived in South Africa. I've lived in BC for a while. I lived in Toronto for a while. But Montreal was always home. I always had an apartment or a place here in Montreal. My parents, my father is here. My brother is here. My sister left for Texas, but it's okay. She's coming home this weekend, actually. But Montreal has always been my home. I was here during the Quiet Revolution. I understood the Quiet Revolution as a gentleman of African descent. I understood what the Francophones were, what the French were going through. It irked me when I heard my classmates referring to French kids as pea soup and frog and Pepsi May West and all of those things. It irked me. It hurt my soul. I understood it. When I was able to vote for the first time, I voted for René Lévesque because Lévesque was a progressive. Despite the separatist values and so forth, and I am not a separatist. He was a progressive. He put people first. After the dust settled, he wanted to sit down with the English community and talk about what their needs were and how they could best be met. This didn't sit well with certain members within the Parti Québécois at the time. But he put people first. Jack Layton put people first. And this is what I think we need to do. As Anglophones, we've spent many years sort of cowering in the corner and saying, okay, I don't want to raise any, I don't want to rock the boat. I want to hang on to what we have. I don't want to get booted out. And while we were doing that, we learned French. We immersed ourselves in the French culture, in the Quebecois culture, not French, the Quebecois culture. And as a result, now, today, we are a completely different animal than Anglophone Canadians, English Canadians. I had the pleasure of serving as a deputy critic of official languages, and met with many organizations from across Canada who are clamoring. Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, BC, clamoring. They came to our committee looking for resources to open more immersion schools because they were looking to at the advantages that they saw or they perceived that Anglophones had in Quebec in terms of having two languages and the advantages that brought, plus the fact that they took the bilingualism of this country very seriously. And they're having a hard time. There are waiting lines, there are waiting lists for schools in all of these provinces that are looking for funding. They are the perception of Anglophones in Quebec. One of the things that I learned, something in and around, my numbers are shaky, but in and around 90% of those people, young people, 50 and under, so in my age category and younger, who identify themselves as English speakers are working or fluently bilingual. 90% can work in either language. On the other side of that, same group of people who are mother tongue French, 12%. We've done the work. We've done the work to integrate into Quebec society. We have a different viewpoint. We have a different view, even in the arts. As an artist, I can speak to this. We have a different view of storytelling. Our storytelling is closer to the Quebec style of storytelling in English than it is to the English style, the English Canadian. While English Canada sort of runs around and tries to make movies and television shows for the American market, out of Montreal in particular, we make films like The Trotsky, like Good Cop, Bon Cop, Bad Cop. We make films that talk about people. We have a different identity here, and we should celebrate that. And we need to sort of come out of the shadows and begin to celebrate that ourselves, without fear, without somebody's going to have to tell me when 10 minutes is up, because I'm not.
You got 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Without fear and without shame, and that's a huge thing. Without shame. As far as the different organizations or different groups that belong, I'm not going to use the term minority because I don't refer to myself as a minority. I am minor to no one, and nobody in this room is minor to anybody because of language or cultural. We are, and I'm really iffy on diverse as well. We all share different experiences. We all bring to the table different experiences. And I think the thing that we're looking for and the thing that we need, whatever system we choose to hang on to, is a state of inclusion. We have to find a way. We need to include ourselves, and we have to make sure that we are included in the decision-making, in the everyday practice of our lives, and in the things that we look for from our neighbors and from ourselves. It has to be inclusive. Thank you.
Thank you, Tyrone. Now, Molly.
Geez, tough act to follow. Okay, well, I'm going to try to answer some more specific questions because I think I cannot beat and I don't think I can add to these really interesting perspectives that were just pronounced. I'm going to answer maybe some more dead-on questions about QS itself and the question of Anglophones. The first thing I wanted to address is one of the organizers was suggesting sort of be brief background in the history of Anglophone left in Quebec, and I think that's been done. But one of the things I thought I would mention is, and Swan omitted that part in her amazing presentation, was after the Quiet Revolution.
I didn't want to do everything.
I know. Well, thank you, because I'm glad that's my bit now. I grew up in Montreal. Obviously, I'm Anglophone, my name, but my parents came from Toronto. They came to Montreal specifically because of the Quiet Revolution in the mid-70s. They chose Quebec because of its history, its rich history of social activism and its diversity, and specifically also for the question of the right of any peoples to self-determination. And so it was a conscious choice for my parents to move here. And I grew up, they could have sent me to English school, but they chose to send me to school in French because that was the dominant language. But I've always been an outsider here throughout my activism because my name is English and because I happen to speak English. But I've never identified with English Quebecers, English-speaking Quebecers. Not because there's any problem with them, but because that was never my identity. And I've allowed myself with this weird identity that I've had throughout my involvement in the UFP and then in Québec solidaire to be a critic of the francophone progressive view, sovereignist view of what is an Anglophone Quebec. I've allowed myself to be critical of that. Why? Because Anglophone, the whole Anglophone, Francophone versus Francophone issue in Quebec, the whole history of that is, to me, has always been a class question. It is not a linguistic question. The linguistic issue is how it was represented throughout history. It's a history of colonization. First, who's on the lower case, who's on the bottom of the pyramid in the social structure? Well, Native peoples, Indigenous peoples, people of color, and for a long time, French-speaking Quebecers and English-speaking Quebecers, children of Irish immigrants and workers. But it's a class issue. Today, one of the questions I was asked to answer was, is there still that stereotype of the oppressor, the Anglophone oppressor in Quebec? Sure, the Molsons are still around, but we also have, French Canadians have also earned the right to oppress other Quebecers too. There's Pelado now, there's other examples. So it's not, to me today, the question is not about language. Yes, language is an important fundamental issue in the whole Quebec question. But to me, the issue that leads us to talk about sovereignty is a social justice. It is an anti-capitalist, anti-neoliberal perspective. So to me, the Anglophone question is relevant, but it is not the fundamental question that we need to be asking ourselves. I wanted to also broach the topic of the sort of BNDP Quebec question. I think that it is relevant that we should ask ourselves, is it important? Should there be an NDP Quebec? I think we need to talk about the fact that there is definitely a problem in Quebec with the left in being able to address the whole question of how we promote sovereignty with the Anglophone population and the English-speaking population. To me, that is very broad. Until we can explain the fundamental necessity of sovereignty to any progressive person, and I think Nora explained it very well, that it is a fundamental right. If you say you are progressive, if you say you're on the left, you cannot deny any group's right to self-determination. That's fundamental. And I think it's the failure of the NDP nationally, and in a lot of the left historically in Canada, is the failure to recognize the right to ask the question, the right to say, I want to determine things on my term. And I think that, unfortunately, because a lot of most of the sovereignty movement has been promoted by nationalist, racist, right-wing organizations of various kinds throughout the last decades, that has tainted what is the real reason that any clear-thinking person would want to fight for sovereignty. I didn't always call myself a sovereignist. I I don't necessarily call myself that now. I agree with sovereignty, and I do believe that sovereignty is fundamentally necessary, or at least the discussion and the emancipation from the actual Canadian Federation is fundamental in any democratic society, that's truly democratic society, that wants to put forward a progressive agenda. Also on the question of language, and I think for sort of the internal criticism that we should be having within Québec solidaire, for those of us who are in the party, we need to look at ways of changing the image of Québec solidaire. Québec solidaire is still very pale, male, and stale, and francophone. Stale, bland. I mean, and it's not. The activists within the party are diverse, but we still represent a very white, very French Canadian image. And there's nothing wrong with that, but that is problematic when you actually look at the program that Québec solidaire has, the positions, the economic, the environmental, all the positions that we put forward, issues for immigration, any native questions. We have the most interesting, the most advantageous program out there, and yet why do people of color, why do most immigrants not vote for us? Why do native people not vote for us? Why do we not really get that vote? They're not represented. They're represented, but not in proportions. I think that's my belief, is that, and it's not because I don't think that the party does not wish it. I believe that that's what we were trying to put forward, but I think that that's a discussion the party has to have. I also think that another way that Québec solidaire needs to reach out to English-speaking Quebecers, is progressive English-speaking Quebecers, is to recognize that the whole discussion with the Parti québécois on alliances, okay, needs to happen from a political, economic sense. It is a fundamental, again, it's a class question. Why are we going to ally with an organization, a political organization, that does not question the economic and democratic and political structure that is the very problem we have here? To me, tonight, the panel is about how will we defeat the Liberals. I think it's how should we defeat neoliberals. I'm not against discussing anything with anybody, but I do not understand why we would even consider discussing alliances with an organization on the basis of sovereignty, when sovereignty, when you're asking people to go from one monarch to another, if you're asking what is the vested interest of the Parti québécois to discuss anything with an organization like Québec solidaire that puts forward anti-capitalist position, that's environmental position, why would the Parti of Québécois want to ally with Québec solidaire? What is its interest? So I understand there's very pragmatic, we have to seem open-minded, but to me that is fundamentally problematic. And then until we can be, yes, recognize the right to sovereignty for any groups, but also recognize, on the other hand, that it has to be a means to a program, not an objective in itself. Until we can do that, we're not even going to rally French-speaking progressives. So to me, the question, again, and I think I'm going to end it on that. Actually, no, one more point. The whole issue, the attitude towards many people have towards the English language, English-speaking people, there has to be a recognition that who is speaking English in Quebec today. There's a couple people left in Westmount who got a lot of money and who have been here for many generations, and they're the old oppressor class. But what about all the Southeast Asian immigrants who came here, who that's the language of the colonizers, and it's the language the only language they can use when they got here to try to get a job and survive? Is that the oppressor of the French-speaking community? No. But we need to recognize that. We need to recognize that you cannot say, oh, you speak English, therefore, you're the oppressor. What about the Black community that populated, Little Burgundy, for example? Are they the oppressing English-speaking class that were oppressing French Canadian, French Quebecers? No. And lastly, I think it's interesting, even on a language issue. I learned recently, I didn't know the history behind why is there such a large community of Italian Quebecers and Greek Quebecers who speak English, right? Why are some immigrant groups speak French or went to the French school system? Why did these? Well, apparently, a lot of Italians, being of Catholic persuasion, tried to go to French schools before Bill 101 and were refused by the French school system because they weren't the right kind of Catholic, right? And so the only school system that would take them was the Protestant school board, if it was Montreal, so the others. And then,
English Catholic school board.
well, there you go. And then when Bill 101 was introduced, everybody was asked to start, all the immigrants should adjust, they should go into French, fine. But then there was an attack on the Italian community because all of a sudden, why did they choose to speak English? And so I think this is a really interesting point, that part of history that a lot of us Quebecers don't realize is that the language that someone speaks is not inherent. It does not define who they are in our community and their political view or their view on what is Quebec. And so I think we just need to be very careful in conclusion how we attach the word Anglophone and to a Quebecer. That's it.
Thank you, Molly. Now we have him here.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm really excited myself to speak in English, but I'm not sure at the end you will be so excited about my English, so you're warned. I'll try. First, let me thank Clara Swan, because really, and Noël Saint-Pierre, the two organizers. Noël, I don't think everybody here knows you. Can I ask you, despite your humility, so Noël is an old friend of, he's a good friend of mine from a long time, not an old friend, he's a good friend. Back in the 80s, where there was a big, huge bunch of refugees coming from Iran, Noël was a really great help. Clara and I know each other, I think, since maybe 4 or 5 years.
Since I beat you in bowling that time.
No? Oh, really? Okay. No, I don't remember those bad. Anyhow, thank you very much for these presentations. I'm tempted to react and use each one of them, each intervention, but I won't go there. First, I want to begin with the. Does everybody hear us at the end? Okay, that's okay. I just want to mention that why have we been so lazy? Why have we been so pale and stale I can do nothing about it, and I'm French speaking, but I'm quite pale. I'm still quite pale. But anyhow, I must admit, we have been lazy in our determination or thinking and trying to do something to open up the dialogue much more than we have been able to do through the last 10 years in the direction of Anglophones, English-speaking Quebecers, but also toward immigrants, toward newcomers, toward racialized communities. Don't think of them as minorities. Let's think of them toward the diversity. Even though, right at the beginning, if you remember, those of you that remember, Québec solidaire was when we got together in 2006. Our first, the first composition of our direction included 5 people that were just, there was Molly Alexander in the beginning of the story with UFP, Union des Forces Progressistes, in 2002, 2003, those days, as a spokesperson from that nascent left party. She was the spokesperson for nationally for Québec solidaire woman spokesperson, and the other one was a guy, a pale male French speaker from Saguenay. No. Pierre Dusty was from Chicoutimi. But in 2006, apart me, there was also Sujata Day, a native of India. Gutierrez, j'ai oublié son prénom. Minerva Gutierrez, born in Mexico. Alexa Conradi, born in New Brunswick, I think, no mistaken. Anyhow, in the Maritimes. And Ruba Ghazal, a Palestinian refugee born somewhere out of Palestine, okay? So in principle, all the elements were there so that we would be very keen and very conscious about the necessities, and also well equipped in terms of people with background, with knowledge of our situations to go there, but we didn't go there. Why? I'm trying to understand it. Of course, when I'm saying laziness, I hope you don't believe that we're sometimes lazy as every human being, but in the whole, Québec solidaire as an organization has been everything else but lazy. But we had an approach over those issues exactly like our approach, for example, toward the student movement or the young people in our organization. From the beginning, our approach was dominated with the universalist view. We have policies of emancipation which address the problems of all society. We are striving for social justice, for public services, for universal rights. So our policies and our activities and our positionment should have something to say to everybody. There is no need to specifically try to engage in a specific conversation, political conversation, towards such and such community or minority. Byron, the students are less than the general society, so they're minority numbers, only in numbers. So, for example, our organization didn't want to have a young section as the liberals have. Why? Because younger members of our organization were saying we don't want to be cornered somewhere as like a second-class member or activist or member. We want to be members plein droit, full members, engaged in debates, regardless of our age. In the same way, people like me, like Ruba, like Sujata, we had this idea with this generous approach that first, it was a good idea to believe that there was no need to have a, like say, a committee over inclusion or immigrant section or anything like that. We address problems and everybody participate in our associations on a equal level with everybody else, and that will do, and that will suffice. And there was a third consideration, and that consideration was the fact that we had seen in the past so many practices of clientelism addressed to minorities, addressed to diversity, addressed to newcomers, as practiced by liberals, as practiced by conservatives, to a lower extent by the NDP, but still, even in the NDP ranks, there was this clientele approach at provincial level, different places in Canada, and we didn't want to go there. We didn't want to engage in a bargain with such and such identified group on our platform. So that brought us where we are today, where we look back, there are important lacks. Those who know me know that usually I have a good memory and I don't take too much notes. But tonight I have taken much more notes than in almost every other of my meetings because I came here really to listen. I'm not saying that to please you, but because we have to think it over. There are very interesting elements that were evoked. I know that we have to take into account, it's a beginning. I don't think we have still found all the necessary elements and decided over anything. It's a beginning. What I would like is that we come out of this defensive approach that we have had toward the English community, which consisted on the parts of the spokesperson or our organization in general, to try to convince them that they don't have to fear us. Instead of going, it's probably what Molly says when he says to pale. Instead of going there and saying, we have a policy of liberation, I took your words, we have a liberatory social projects, try to frame with a left perspective the question of sovereignty along the lines of self-determination, along the lines of the constituent assembly in which they would take part. Every element was there, but we were on the defensive. We thought that all Anglophones, our English speakers, are afraid of the possibility that Quebec separates politically from Canada. So let's try to give them assurances that, you know, we are not ethnics. We will be democratic. Everybody will have a say. So we were always in the defensive, and I think that defensive approach, its consequence is that the English community also approaches us with a little bit of, you know, like defensive. They're defensive, you know, like in any meeting between two parts or two individuals or two community, a defensive approach is not very warm and engaging. And I think that we should come out of our paleness, and we will see about our maleness. Okay, now, but I must say two things. We cannot disregard the fact that, notwithstanding what the Gazette says or CJD, there is a big chunk of the Quebec English left which has a genuine attachment to Canada, of an idea of Canada which is not the idea, the colonial idea of Canada, an idea of Canada which is not Harper or even Justin Trudeau. Although the presence of Justin Trudeau helps a lot in the remaking of the image of that colonial Canada or conservative Canada. And that genuine left has a lot to hope also because of the experience of the recent NDP at the federal level of Jack Layton and progressive forces elsewhere in Canada who truly envisage the possibility to bring some policies of change, of structural change, of economical change at different levels in Canada. And the nation-building process through which Canada has gone through the last 50 years, although I would like to hear you guys and girls that know more about Canada, about my view on that issue. That nation-building was done by the Trudeau heritage, but then was adopted by the Conservatives to some extent, but also by the NDP. And today, that has some important impact on the fact that any party like us who promotes the idea that Quebec should self-determine itself and if the people decide become a sovereign state, does not please those people, even if they're not. When you speak to somebody who is left-leaning and you evoke the notion that, you know, people can decide for themselves, self-determination, of course they will agree. But in the bottom of their heart, there is yet un déchirement. This we have to take into effect that they are torn. And through all those years that I have worked on those issues, I haven't found a way to reinsure. Although Jack was, those who don't know that, you know, all through the years that Jack Layton was in charge of the direction of the NDP, he always took every opportunity he had to meet us, to come and see us. Twice a year, sometimes 2 times a year. He even came to Montreal and we went just having a lunch and discussing François, I and him, when it was not Jack Layton, it was before him, Sven Robinson. And through those discussions, I had the true impression that for Jack, it was not a problem. That when I was telling to him, Jack, the day the Quebec will become a sovereign state, a sovereign country, I will celebrate with my people because that would be their choice. But the second day, 8 o'clock in the morning, wait for me at your office because I will come up with a new project of unity between people, not only French-speaking Quebec and English-speaking Canada, it's the end, I'm finishing, but a new unity based on people's right, not on a colonial heritage. And you know, this sounded very agreeable for people like Jack, and I'm sure for many others. But in Quebec, it's not common, and we have to also find a way to take into account the fact that people, genuinely left-leaning people, are torn between their loyalty to these notions. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I was just going to ask, do you have questions for each other? We're going to give the audience the opportunity to ask questions and participate, but do you want to go straight to that, or do you have questions for each other? No? Okay, so the way we usually work at Quebec Solidaire is we use a parity system. Usually we'll have two, in fact, 3 microphones, one for men, one for women, and one for gender-neutral people. Tonight we'll function in, we'll ask for a woman speaker to start us off. If there's a gender-neutral speaker, we'll pass that over to them. And then we'll have a male speaker, and then we return to the female speaker. We'll just keep going. So if anybody wants to speak, you want to speak, Nadia? Okay, so I'm going to come over with the microphone so that everybody can hear you.
Thank you.
Can you introduce yourself first?
Oh, yeah, my name is Nadia. I have a cold, I'm sorry. My name is Nadia Alexandre, and I'm the founder of Citizens in Action Montreal. We hold conferences once a month on different political issues. So you're welcome to come and attend any of them. I've done the second Tuesday of every month. My fear is that once we have sovereignty, what if we have sovereignty with a charret or a couillard? I mean, what makes you think that once we have sovereignty, the couillards and the charrets of this world are going to disappear? I don't understand.
Is there someone who'd like to take that question?
Take several questions.
Take several questions, and then, okay, so we have a male speaker to ask a question. We're going to do an additive question thing here. Someone else want to ask a question? I'm sorry, we're going to the gender neutral. Is that okay, or we go to a man? Okay, so let's get a white male speaking. There hasn't been any white males speaking tonight at all, so we're in good shape, right, Molly? Yeah. Right. Okay. So is there someone who'd like to ask a question? Okay, I'll come over here.
My name is Scott Weinstein, and I won't tell you which group I'm with. I think the question for us is, you know, here we are in 2017, and the issue of nationalism and sovereignty in Quebec has pretty much gone through the meat grinder, and we are left with something that is unrecognizable to what it was 30, 40, 50 years ago. And frankly, you know, I am confused as to how we address this in a just way. I understand how we can address it in a political way, because we have to address it. It's obligatory to say we're for sovereignty in Quebec, and I have no problem with that. But I don't see an answer from Quebec Solidaire as to how we can address it in a meaningful way that addresses the progressive aspirations of, I think, pretty much everybody in this room.
Thank you. Do we want to go to answers now, or maybe a third one?
Because they're difficult, so we're just...
Patricia?
I'm Patricia. Alexander dragged that baby to Quebec. I just wanted to say, and I volunteered for Anne Lagacé Dawson in the last federal election, the Trudeau Mania 2.0. And so we had an office for her. She was in Papineau riding. We had an office in, what's Alexandre Bouleri's riding called when we're federal? Rosemont, oui. That's where I live. So in that office, I was amazed, stupéfiant. This place was lively, bouncing. It had dozens and dozens and dozens of people day and night working, and they were people of color. I would say 95%. It was astonishing. And they were on the phones, and they were speaking Arabic and languages of West Africa. There were Latinos there. We could talk to anybody in that room, a few Asians too. And that was for the NDP. And so I just want to ask people, and so these were very young people. They were the age of university students. And they understand self-determination. A number of them were from Québec solidaire, like me, but they were not afraid of a concept of self-determination. They comprehend Indigenous people's rights. They comprehend women's rights. And you're right, absolutely, to divorce, whether or not you want to get one, you absolutely have to have the right to get it if you want it. And I don't think that they have a problem with self-determination. So how come, and it's also going to be a problem for us, because after the Orange Wave, Tom Mulcair got up there very quickly and said, and come the next election, there's absolutely going to be a Quebec section of the NDP. And I don't know where the hell he got that, but so somebody said, maybe we can talk about it if we want to. Anyway, that whole experience interested me greatly, and I'd like to know what people have to say about it. Why they've got them.
Shall we toss a fourth question in? Or?
I'm not really sure what the question is.
Oh, Patricia, the clarification of question.
I want to know why you feel, maybe you're not aware of it, I wasn't, but how come the NDP has got all those young people? I'm not very worried about explaining to those of us who are going to die in the next 2 decades. But these young people, somebody's going to be able to talk to them, and they're able to talk to Quebecers, and they're not afraid of it. So I don't think that's the worry. I want to know how come the NDP is so attractive to them, and why shouldn't we be, as Taylor said, attractive to?
Okay. Are we ready to have some answers?
You included in the questions. So don't
Well, I'm going to prioritize the other voices at the table.
We'll start with Nora.
Yeah. So the first two questions say to me that actually this is more of a question about sovereignty than a question about Anglophones and sovereignty, right? Because I do a lot of work to try and have some friends who aren't political, which is really hard. And so I play soccer with a bunch of guys every week, well, twice a week, different guys. And when we do talk about sovereignty, it's so funny because they have these questions as well. They're all francophones, we're speaking French. And they approach me as like, oh, you must be a federalist because you're an Anglophone. I say, no, I'm a sovereigntist. And they're not convinced because the project has changed so much. And I think that that's actually very useful because if we are going to be able to capture the spirit that drove the sovereignty movement, then it has to be driven from the left by talking about social programs, by talking about what does it actually mean